There's a frustration that almost everyone who has done serious therapy has encountered. The moment when you understand exactly what's happening psychologically, you can articulate the pattern clearly, you can trace its origins, and then nothing changes. You go back out into your life, and the next time the relevant situation arises, you respond in exactly the same way you always have. The insight was real. The understanding was genuine. And it made no immediate difference. This experience, which can be profoundly discouraging, is actually predictable and explicable. Freud gave it a name and a theoretical account: resistance, and its counterpart, working through. Freud recognized early in his clinical practice that interpretation was not cure. A patient might receive an accurate interpretation of their unconscious conflict, recognize its truth intellectually, and yet continue to produce the same symptoms, the same relational patterns, the same defensive responses. Understanding the source of the problem did not, by itself, resolve the problem. Why not? The answer lay in the nature of resistance. Freud had always recognized that resistance, the patient's unconscious opposition to the therapeutic process, to the emergence of repressed material, to change itself, was a constant feature of analytic work. But he came to recognize that resistance didn't simply evaporate when confronted with accurate interpretation. It reorganized. It found new forms. It persisted in the patient's characteristic patterns of relating and responding long after the intellectual content of the conflict had been made conscious. The interpretations might be accurate, but the patient's psychological structure was organized around the very patterns that the interpretations were addressing. Changing those patterns required more than a single moment of understanding. Working through is Freud's term for the process by which the insight achieved through interpretation is gradually consolidated into genuine psychological change. The slow, repetitive, emotionally engaged process of encountering the same pattern multiple times, from multiple angles, with different degrees of emotional participation, until the pattern begins to lose its grip. It is not a single event but an extended process. The same insight must be encountered again and again, in different contexts, with different emotional valences, before it can be integrated deeply enough to modify the underlying character structure rather than simply the patient's intellectual understanding of it. This process can be frustrating because it feels, from the inside, like going over the same ground repeatedly without progress. But Freud insisted that this apparent repetition was not regression, it was the work itself. Each repetition was not simply revisiting what had already been learned. It was encountering the same material from a slightly different angle, with slightly different effect, in a slightly different relational context, adding another layer of experience that gradually modified the pattern from inside. Modern neuroscience has provided a compelling biological account of why working through takes the time it does. The patterns that psychoanalytic therapy addresses are embedded in neural circuits that have been reinforced through years of repetition. Changing these circuits requires new experience, new relational encounters that activate different response patterns, different emotional sequences, different ways of organizing the self in relation to others. This kind of neural change happens through repeated new experience over time. A single moment of insight activates new neural circuitry once. Working through activates it many times, across many different contexts, until the new pattern begins to develop the kind of strength and accessibility that the old pattern had accumulated over decades. The implication for anyone engaged in the work of psychological change is both sobering and reassuring. Sobering, because it means that genuine change is genuinely slow, that the expectation of rapid transformation after a key insight is almost always disappointed. Reassuring, because it means that the apparent stuckness of the early stages of therapy, the discouraging sense that understanding changes nothing, is not the final word. Working through takes time. But it works. The deep patterns that have organized a person's life for decades can, with sufficient repetition in a good enough therapeutic environment, gradually and genuinely change. Subscribe to Psychology. Theories explained for more psychology breakdowns every week.